Imagine standing on land where ancient leaders once gathered, where important memorials are standing right now, and where the birthplace of, well, a really key figure who totally revolutionized the language is honored. Now think about this. That same land is currently looked after by a federal agency, one known more for, managing rivers and generating power. But there's this proposal now to formally place it back into the care of the tribe, whose history is just, well, woven right into the soil there. That's really the heart of what we're diving into today. It's a specific piece of legislation making its way through Congress right now. We're focusing on H.R.226. It's known as the Eastern Band of Cherokee Historic Lands Reacquisition Act. And our mission, really, in this deep dive is to pull apart this bill just using its own text. What exactly is it proposing to do? What specific land are we talking about? Why this land? Why is it significant? And what are the practical conditions attached to actually transferring it? We really want to give you a clear picture of this proposed law, just based directly on the source material itself.
And that source is, it's the official text of the bill, specifically the version that passed the House of Representatives, and it's now been referred over to the Senate. So it gives us the exact legislative language, outlining this whole potential land transfer.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this then. So at its core, the bill proposes taking certain federal lands and also some associated easements located in Tennessee and holding them in trust, that's the term they use, for the benefit of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the EBCI.
And understanding that phrase, taking land into trust, is pretty central here, you're right. Think of it like this. The U.S. government would hold the, let's say, formal legal title to the land, but it's actually managed and used for the benefit of the tribe. Now, this status, it often means the land falls under tribal jurisdiction. It can be free from certain state or local taxes, maybe regulations, though, as this bill really shows, there can be very specific conditions tied to these particular parcels. It's not always straightforward.
Got it. So the U.S. government is like the trustee holding it for the tribe, who's the beneficiary.
Yeah.
Okay. And according to the bill, where exactly is this located?
It specifies Monroe County, Tennessee, right on the shores of Tellico Reservoir. That's the specific wording.
And who looks after this land now before any transfer happens?
Currently, according to the source, it's federal land. And it's under the management of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. So the bill is basically proposing a shift from TVA stewardship over to this trust relationship with the EBCI.
All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty details then. What specific pieces of land are we actually talking about being taken into trust?
Okay, so the bill outlines specific land parcels. They're generally described as being located on or above the 820-foot contour elevation, which is essentially, above a certain level relative to sea level, likely tied to the reservoir's water levels, and lists three main areas, gives approximate acreage, and importantly, ties them to specific maps included within the bill itself.
Okay, so give us the rundown. What are they?
First up, there's the Sequoyah Museum property. That's approximately 46 acres. And the bill points to map 1 for that one.
Sequoyah, the inventor of the Cherokee syllabary. Wow. I mean, that's an incredibly significant figure. Okay, what else?
There's also a property that's designated for support. That's about 11.9 acres, shown on map 2. And then there's the combined Chota Memorial property and the Tanasi Memorial property. Together, those total roughly 18.2 acres, and they're depicted on map 3.
Chota and Tanasi. Yeah, those were major former capitals of the Cherokee Nation. So these are sites with, profound historical weight. I think I noticed the bill mentions a really specific detail about the Chota Memorial area within that 18.2 acres, something about a radius.
Yes, exactly, a very precise measurement. It clarifies that the Chota Memorial area includes all land within a circle that has an 86-foot radius, measured from the center of the memorial itself. And crucially, that's regardless of the elevation within that specific small circle. It just makes sure that key spot is definitely included.
Huh. That level of detail really shows how specific legislative language can get sometimes. And the bill mentions existing structures too, right? Like buildings.
It does, yeah. It clarifies that any improvements or memorials already on this land, like the museum building itself or the actual memorial structures, they remain the property of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. It also requires updated official maps of the transferred land. Those need to be completed within a year of the transaction actually happening.
Oh, okay. So that's the solid ground, the land parcels. But the bill also talks about easements. What exactly are those and which ones are included here?
Good point. Yeah, an easement is different from owning the land outright. It's a legal right to use a portion of land that's owned by someone else, but only for a specific purpose. In this bill's case, these are permanent easements being taken into trust. And they're specifically for areas below that 820-foot contour elevation, again, near the reservoir shores there in Monroe County.
Right. So not owning the land below that line, but having the defined right to use it for something specific. Okay. What are the easement areas listed in the bill?
There are two main easement areas mentioned. One is on the Chota Peninsula, that's approximately 8.5 acres, and it's depicted as Chota Memorial 2 on map 3.
Okay. And the other one?
The second is designated as the Chota Tanasi Trail area. That covers about 11.4 acres, also shown there on map 3. And just like with the land parcels, the bill requires revised maps for these easement areas too within a year.
So if we add up the approximate acreage from the bill, the land parcels are about 76 acres. The easements are roughly 20 acres. We're looking at a total proposed transfer area of around 96 acres, give or take, all to be held in trust for the EBCI. It's a significant area, but also quite focused geographically. Okay, so we know what land and easements are involved, but the bill also specifies why. What are the stated purposes? What's this land supposed to be used for?
Yeah, this is a really key part of the bill, Section 4 actually. For most of the land parcels, basically everything except that separate support property, the principal purposes are explicitly laid out. They are memorializing and interpreting the history and culture of Indians and recreational activities. That's the direct quote.
Okay, that makes sense. It aligns directly with the significance of places like Chota, Tanasi, and the Sequoyah site. What specific activities does the bill mention supporting?
It lists several things: managing and operating programs for the Sequoyah Birthplace Memorial and the museum there, doing the same for the memorials to Chota and Tanasi, which the bill describes as former capitals of the Cherokees. Also, activities related to the memorial and a place for reinterment of remains and cultural items. That includes those transferred under NIG-ABRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And finally, interpreting the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail.
What's fascinating here is how the bill doesn't just, transfer land. It specifically ties the transfer directly to preserving and interpreting these specific, deeply meaningful historical and cultural aspects. It sounds like it's really about creating a dedicated place for remembrance, for education, and connection to heritage.
Absolutely. It really grounds the whole land reacquisition in very tangible cultural and historical goals. It centers these sites that were just pivotal to Cherokee identity and history. It's not just about acreage.
Right. And that 11.9 acre support parcel, what's its specific role then?
The bill states its main purpose is explicitly to support the other properties and the EBCI's programs related to them. It even lists examples like providing space for classrooms, maybe conference rooms, cultural education programs, potentially temporary housing for guests, and definitely office space for the tribe's management of these sites.
Okay, so it's kind of the operational hub, the back end for managing the historical and cultural sites. Makes sense. And the easements, what's their purpose?
Those easements, the ones below the 820-foot level, are primarily for recreational trails. That includes things like putting up interpretive signs, maybe benches, compatible improvements. The bill specifically mentions the trail area near the Chota Memorial on the peninsula, and also the trail that connects the Chota and Tanasi memorials.
Okay, now this is where it gets, I think, really interesting, because the bill isn't just a simple handover, is it? It includes this whole section on practical conditions, use rights, especially because the land is right next to, and sometimes literally under, the water of a major reservoir managed by the TVA.
It really does. It highlights the complexity, integrating these historical land claims with existing federal infrastructure, like the reservoir and its operational needs. The bill actually details specific rights that the TVA keeps to make sure their ongoing mission isn't compromised by this transfer.
Like what? I saw something about flooding rights, like the TVA keeping the right to temporarily and intermittently flood the lands and access roads below the 824-foot elevation. That sounds like a pretty significant operational right.
It is, yeah. And they also retain the right to draw down and fluctuate the water level of Tellico Reservoir itself, and even permanently flood adjacent lands, but only those below the 815-foot elevation mark. Plus, the bill grants TVA personnel what it calls a reasonable right of entry onto the land, specifically for their river control and development purposes.
Okay, so even though the land would be held in trust for the EBCI, the TVA still has these critical access and control rights specifically tied to managing the reservoir. What about the EBCI's rights, then, near the water's edge? Are there conditions on what they can do?
Yes, the bill is quite specific about that, too. The EBCI can construct and operate certain non-habitable structures, so It's not meant for permanent living in that zone
Okay.
between the 815-foot and 820-foot elevation near the reservoir. But, and this is a big, but only with written consent from the TVA, and they'd be subject to whatever terms the TVA sets. And critically, these structures must not be prone to, serious flood damage.
And what about actual water use facilities, like docks or something?
Similar conditions there. The EBCI can build or operate water use facilities down to that 815-foot elevation, and even in adjacent waters, but again, only with written consent from the TVA. And the bill explicitly states that the EBCI's use rights may not be exercised so as to interfere in any way with the Tennessee Valley Authority's statutory program for river control and development.
That makes sense, I guess. The TVA's core mission related to the river has to take precedence in those specific sensitive areas. What about financial conditions? Any money changing hands?
Well, the bill mentions that if any future development on these lands impacts hydropower capacity for the TVA, then compensation would be required. It'd be based on TVA guidelines unless, they reach some other kind of agreement. There's also a very clear liability clause. It says the United States is not liable for loss or damage caused by the temporary or permanent flooding or wave action or water level fluctuations that come from the reservoir operations.
So that puts the responsibility, the onus of dealing with those reservoir impacts squarely on the EBCI once they accept the land in trust under these specific conditions.
It does. However, there's a really crucial provision in there regarding environmental responsibility. This is important. It places the continuing and sole responsibility for any environmental remediation and liability under both federal and state law for these specific lands, squarely on the TVA.
Oh, that seems really important. So what does that actually involve?
It means the TVA has to conduct an assessment for hazardous substances before the land is even taken into trust. They have to do their homework first. And then they must notify the Secretary of the Interior and the EBCI of what they find. If it turns out hazardous substances were ever stored there for a year or more, or released, or disposed of on the land, the TVA has to provide a detailed report. That report needs to cover the type and quantity, when it happened, and any cleanup actions they might have already taken.
So basically, this protects the tribe from inheriting the burden or maybe the cost of cleaning up environmental issues that happened while the land was under federal management by the TVA.
Precisely. It's a critical safeguard, and it's written right into the legislation itself.
Okay. Now, while the bill outlines all these specific uses and conditions, it's also very clear about something that can't happen on these lands once they're in trust status.
Right. Yes, absolutely. The bill includes a very specific prohibition, Section 7, I believe. It says Class 2 or Class 3 gaming, as defined by federal law, which, basically means casino-style gaming is explicitly not permitted on the lands taken into trust under this specific act.
Okay, so cultural preservation, historical interpretation, recreation, supporting facilities, definitely yes. Casino gaming, explicitly no. That's a clear line drawn for these particular lands. And finally, just to ground this, where does this bill actually stand in the legislative process right now, based on our source?
According to the source material we have, H.R.226 passed the House of Representatives back on February 4th, 2025. It was then received by the Senate and referred to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs the very next day, February 5th, 2025. So as of that date, it's currently under consideration in the Senate.
Right.
So pulling it all together then, H.R.226 proposes taking about, 96 acres, including land and easements near the Tellico Reservoir, currently TVA land, and placing it into trust for the eastern band of Cherokee Indians. And the bill is very specific that the primary purpose is cultural and historical preservation interpretation-related activities, focusing on sites deeply important to Cherokee history, like the former capitals Chota and Tanasi and Sequoyah's birthplace area.
Exactly. But as we've discussed, this isn't just a blank slate transfer, it's complex. The TVA keeps significant rights for managing the reservoir, and those rights impact how the EBCI can use areas near the water's edge, often requiring TVA consent for any construction there. The EBCI accepts the potential impacts from reservoir operations, like flooding risks, but crucially, the TVA is held solely responsible for cleaning up any pre-existing environmental contamination on the land. And yeah, that key restriction, no casino gaming allowed on these specific parcels. Diving into the details of a bill like H.R.226 really shows that this kind of land reacquisition legislation is so much more than just transferring acreage numbers on a map. It's really about balancing historical claims, deep cultural connections, the ongoing operational needs of federal agencies like the TVA, specific environmental responsibilities, and even dictating or limiting future economic uses for that land. It's just a really complex weave of history, law, and practicalities.
It really is. And you can almost see how each clause in the bill represents some kind of negotiation, a balancing of these different layers of interest and responsibility and history.
So thinking about all these specific conditions laid out in the bill, things like the potential for flooding, the need to get TVA consent for certain activities near the water, that whole required environmental cleanup assessment, what do you, listening, think is maybe the most complex aspect of actually managing lands that come with such detailed, layered use rights like these? And how does seeing legislation specifically outline purposes like memorializing former capitals, creating places for reinterment, alongside provisions for trails and support facilities, how does that shape your understanding of what historic lands reacquisition truly encompasses, beyond simply, changing who technically owns the land?